Welcome to Beyond Values, Building an Ethical Business Environment. I am Mike Coffey, president of Imperative Information Group. I'm an HR guy who happens to own a background screening company, Imperative, but I still get to spend most of my time either working with clients around employee selection or employee relations issues, running my own organization, and doing the podcast, which we'll talk about in a little while. GoodMorningHR.com is the podcast, but we'll talk about that at the end. So this webinar, this presentation really is the third in a trilogy that didn't start out as a trilogy necessarily. For the Fort Worth Human Resources Management Association, Fort Worth HR, 2 or 3 years ago for their strategic conference, I put together a presentation around strategy, execution, and the art of saying no. And that was just really HRCI business credit. That conference and that presentation was obviously about strategy and execution, but values were part of that. And I got a lot of feedback on the values part, that people were really interested in trying to understand the values piece and how you create values and implement those in an organization. And so I created a presentation just around values, which we did a couple of weeks ago here. And then in January, HRCI kicked in their requirement that you have an hour of ethics recertification credit to recertify. And so I took it to the next step and decided, let's talk something a little bit beyond values and get into the ethical discussion. And so here we are. I'll be curious throughout the webinar. If you have questions, drop them in the chat box, because I'd be interested in seeing what you've got, what your questions are. I probably won't look at them until the end, but please, as they come, drop them in there. Or if you've got anecdotes or your own experiences, I'd love to hear those too. So let's start with what sounds like bad news, but maybe is good news. This is from the Edelman Survey. The Edelman organization does this survey twice a year, and it's all about trust. What institutions worldwide do people trust, and what do they distrust, and what are the trust levels, and how do they change over time? And you can see here, it's interesting that most of the organizations, institutions in our society that would tend to have, you would think have a lot of trust, are all at, pretty low. Religious leaders are at 45% trust. Government leaders at 50%. Journalists at 50%, and then CEOs in general, your typical business CEO leader is at 55. But then it jumps up pretty dramatically, doesn't it, when you look at my employer, and you see that people are really they have trust in the CEO where they work. And I think that's insightful, because there is probably some group bias there that kicks in, but it doesn't matter if it's a bias or not. It gives employers a little bit of room to play as far as when we're dealing with our organization and our employees. They do tend to have trust in us. In fact, according to the survey, you can see that employers' media is the most trusted source of information. If the majority of the respondents hear information once or twice from their employer, they're more likely to believe it than if they hear it from the national government, from media sources, from other corporations, or in advertising. And then you see social media is the lowest, which is interesting, because we hear so much about how social media is ruining our country, but really it seems like the majority of people distrust news that they get from social media. So but the takeaway I want you to have is that employers' media, the information that people get from their employers about whatever issues the employer chooses to communicate about, is the most trusted source, at least for the respondents. And it has been consistently over time from the respondents to the Edelman survey. Ooh, I skipped one too far. So the percentage of respondents who say that business is outperforming government in facing key challenges in society. Again, you can see that it's 42% of people say that business is doing a good job of addressing social issues, whereas government is only at 35. And the first topic there being economic growth, but you can see responding to health and public safety issues, business is more trusted than government. Guarding information quality, business is more trusted. Fixing systemic inequalities in our society, business is more trusted. So that's, that may be surprising to you. As kind of the crackpot libertarian in my circles, it's not a big surprise to me that people are going to trust business over government, but it is for some folks a real shock. We've got all this trust from our employees, but what's interesting is that we have to do something with that trust to earn it and maintain it. And 80% of the employees expect their company to act on issues facing the broader society. So that's a pretty big responsibility. And they asked about specific issues: vaccine hesitancy, climate change, the effects of automation and job loss from that. The infodemic, again, it's information quality issues, racism, immigration and border security. Those are all above 70%. Those are big issues, and people expect their employer to act on these social issues. And so there's trust there, but there's also an expectation that we have a bigger impact than just making sure they've got a paycheck every week. And they expect us to, as business leaders, to prioritize social issues even more. You can see the US is the far right column. And so there's an expectation that businesses address things like gender and ethnic pay equality, ensure that the company is trusted by, so don't squander your reputation. There's a lot of expectation from our employees. They trust us, but they expect us to do things. And really, I just argue that that's good news for us, right? As employers, the good news is that our employees trust us, but we have to do something with that trust if we're going to hold on to it. And maybe, we've spent so much time worrying about employee engagement and those things, which is really, really important. But maybe one of the things that we're not doing to increase employee engagement is tying those employees closer to us by speaking out on what's right and have employees continuing to have a high confidence that we're not going to just do the right thing in the context of how we conduct our own business, but maybe that we're going to do the right thing as corporate citizens in a larger community. But I see all of these slides as really positive for us, for most businesses, because people trust who they work for over all those other institutions, and they look to us for guidance and leadership. So that's a responsibility that comes from being the leaders in the organizations. I'm kind of watching the comments over here too to make sure I'm not missing anything. So let's talk about different ways that we as business leaders exercise our responsibilities towards our employees. And first of all, we all know basic compliance. Compliance is just following the laws, following the rules, sticking to our policies, doing what we say we're going to do to the letter, right? And we know compliance, it's pretty straightforward. We know it when we see it. The speed limit is 55 miles an hour, and you drive 55, but if you hit 60, you're less compliant, right? 75 is even, a higher risk, and you're probably creating more risk for the organization. So we know compliance. We know OSHA, and in the HR world, we're talking about OSHA compliance, Fair Labor Standards Act compliance, classifying your employees correctly. And I talk to a lot of employers who are misclassifying their employees, and they know they're misclassifying their employees, but they know there's some benefit to them from doing it. But when employees see that, they're saying, okay, my employer is not necessarily all that compliant. But compliance probably isn't enough to call us an ethical organization, right? This is Andy Fastow. He was the CFO of Enron. And those of you who are in Texas will definitely remember Enron. They filed bankruptcy back in 2001. They took down the accounting firm Arthur Andersen with them, and a whole bunch of other players were injured or went out of business due to the Enron failure. What Enron was basically doing was putting their high-risk assets and maybe their money-losing assets off their main balance sheet into other organizations, other corporate entities, so that their books looked really good to investors. But investors didn't see all the high-risk stuff they were doing and the things that were losing money. So it made the company look a lot more profitable than it actually turned out to be. That's a problem for investors who are pouring their money in there. It's a problem for employees who had a lot of their retirement or all of their retirement tied into Enron stock. What's interesting is maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I had the opportunity to attend a dinner with Andy Fastow. He went to federal prison for the Enron stuff, and he's out of prison now, and he's making the circuit speaking to business leaders about business ethics. And so I thought this will be, I was working on this presentation at the time, and I thought, I gotta go make sure I make this dinner, because this will be an interesting conversation to hear. What is this guy who helped take down and blow up or sink one of the larger corporations in the country at the time? What does he say about ethics now? And what's interesting, and I don't think I'm talking out of school here, is that what he said was, yeah, we didn't do the right thing at Enron. But when he went deeper into it, what he said was, we mispriced the risk. So in other words, it wasn't we just didn't do the right thing. What we did was we knew we were doing the wrong thing, but we didn't think about, if we get caught, what is it going to mean for the company? And I would argue that if you're thinking about what happens if we get caught doing the wrong thing, we can do the wrong thing as long as we don't get caught. But if we're going to do the wrong thing, we need to figure out what it would mean, if we get caught, to the what it'll mean to the future of the organization. That's just not ethical, right? If ethical behavior is doing the right thing, making the right moral choice, and you're deciding as you make decisions, I'm going to do what I know I have to hide. I know it's got to be kept secret. I'm going to do this, and because I think I could get away with it, or if I do get caught, it won't be that bad on the company. And what he said was, we mispriced the risk of getting caught. But the other thing he said is, we were in compliance. He still to this day insists that Enron didn't violate any laws, any SEC requirements. They didn't violate generally accepted accounting practices. And in fact, he said, we had paper all over every deal. We had lawyers approve every deal. We had outside counsel. We had our accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, approve every deal. They went through everything and they approved the deals. So we were compliant, is what he is saying. He did go to federal prison, so I don't know that in the end he really was fully compliant. But again, this is an example of where you can look compliant on paper maybe, but that doesn't mean what you're doing is necessarily ethical. And we'll come back to Enron and Andy Fastow and just a couple times here in the presentation, because it's a good lesson, and maybe the pain isn't quite as sharp as some of the more recent scandals we've had. So that's compliance. Now, the DNA of your organization, though, are your organizational values. And as I said earlier, I've got a whole presentation that I made a few weeks ago. It's on our website if you want to go look at it. You can see it for free and get HRCI and SHRM credit for it. But values are the DNA of the organization. They communicate, your values communicate to your employees, to your suppliers, to your investors and shareholders, all the stakeholders, the larger community. Your values communicate what you as an organization value, right? This is the behavior we value. And I'll say this, organizations like companies, corporate entities don't have values. The leaders have values, the employees have values, people have values, behaviors that we value, behaviors we model in our own behavior. But the organization doesn't really have values. It's, it's just like machinery. Your forklift doesn't have values. Your PC doesn't have values. But the person driving that forklift, the person operating that PC, they have values. And the organization, as all the group of people, when I'm talking about the organization, leadership on down, your values aren't necessarily what are up on the wall in your organization or on the back of your name badge in your organization. Those are maybe aspirational. The values in your organization are the things that you really demonstrate that you value in how you reward employees, how you select and promote employees, how you compensate people, how things get done in your organization, how people are allowed to treat one another. Those are your values. That's what really the values are all about. And so you can say our values are integrity and honesty and apple pie on Sunday mornings, but the reality is the way things really get done in your organization can be totally different from that. And your employees and everybody else who interacts with your organization can tell what your values really are simply by interacting with you. And so in my values presentation, one of the things I suggest is if you as an organization decide these values are aspirational, it's not where we want to go. It's where we want to go, but it's not where we're at, then don't announce them. Start changing your leadership's behavior, start changing the behavior of how people are treated, how people are selected, promoted, incentivized, and see for a while if you can even do it. And if you can, then people already know what your values are. The poster should be something to help initiate somebody who's brand new to the organization to your values. Your employees ought to know in their heart what your values are, because it's how they're treated, it's how they're rewarded, and it's the behavior you incentivize on an ongoing basis. So here's Enron's famous values: integrity, communication, respect, and excellence. And these are pictures of other Enron leaders being carried off to jail. So you can see how clearly at Enron, their values were aspirational, or they were just good PR. It's things that, they stuck up in the boardroom someplace, and they felt very proud of themselves for coming up with, because they hired an outside PR firm or somebody to come in and help them design that. But in reality, the way they conducted their business wasn't with integrity. They didn't communicate the things that investors certainly needed to know about their business. Respect, I don't think they showed respect for their employees, for investors, or any of those folks, and certainly not excellence. So, our value statements aren't necessarily how things really get done in the organization. And we need to remind ourselves all the time that the real values are what really happens on the floor, in the office, with how people are treated, and the decisions we make in our business on a daily basis. So then we get to ethics. And as I said earlier, ethics is the idea that we're going to do the right thing. What's the morally right choice? And certainly compliance can be part of an ethical behavior. But your own moral judgment is what really defines ethics. And there can be times, obviously, where the right thing, the morally right thing to do may not be compliant. That should be probably rare in most organizations, but there are times where we have to say, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to do that, even though our policy states otherwise. I mean, I'm certainly, you want to document why you did this, why things were different, but in my 30 years in HR's had a reputation at times of being, by the book, 100%, regardless of the outcome. We have to follow policies and procedures with no exception. And there's times where maybe the right thing to do is to do otherwise. And we should, obviously, you want to document that. You want to make sure that the appropriate levels of management have been approved, have approved of whatever deviations you're doing. But there's times where compliance strictly shouldn't be our outcome. And individually, every one of your employees has their own values. They have things that they value, the behaviors that they want to demonstrate in the workplace, the things that how they want to be treated, how they value how other people treat them. They've got all kinds of values, and we want people largely to live according to their values. But at the same time, we need to realize that you can live according to your values, but still be seen as unethical by other people or even the broad society. So like if one of your values is winning at all cost, makes sense, right? That's if you've got salespeople in your organization, you're probably really aware of what it feels like to work with people who are a real type A, dog eat dog, but that can go too far in how you treat people, and it's maybe the decisions you make as a leader in an organization. If winning at all costs is what you really value, you can see how that could have a really negative impact on the community, on your employees, on suppliers. And so you can be seen as unethical, even though you're following your own values. And as business leaders, we need to consider that. There's going to be times where doing the right thing won't be popular, and we need to recognize those times. But there are times where we're being consistent with our own personal values and maybe the shared values in the organization, but the impact of making the wrong decision would be really negative, because the larger community will see that, well, that may be their values, but that's not a place I want to work. That's an unethical organization. I don't see that as particularly valuable. And we'll talk about governance and some of those issues in just a little bit where that'll play out. But there's certain kinds of ethical misconduct that we just recognize, right? Abusive behavior, behavior that's coercive, threatening, intimidating. It just creates that hostile work environment. We know that it may not be illegal abuse. I just had a conversation with someone yesterday who reached out to me for advice. They're a professional who is in a role with a boss who's a real jerk and yells at people, treats employees pretty poorly. Hasn't crossed that line of illegal retaliation, but certainly retaliates when an employee stands up for themselves or refuses to do things that they're not comfortable with, even though they may not be statutorily protected actions. But that's retaliation, and it's not illegal retaliation, but it's retaliation. And we know that kind of behavior when we see it, and that's obviously ethical misconduct in most organizations. Then there's conflicts of interest. So where we use our authority or our own power in the organization to benefit ourselves, and often to the detriment of the organization. And there's other kinds of conflict where we use our power for private gain. Then obviously discrimination, and probably illegal discrimination and other kinds of discrimination that may not yet be illegal. That's still probably not ethical, right? And so we've got age, race, sex, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, all those things that we recognize. But there may be cases where we discriminate against somebody for reasons that aren't in the best interest of the organization, but they're just our personal preferences. For a long time, people with tattoos had a hard time getting a job in a public-facing role or even inside of certain companies. And now you go into a lot of companies and you'll see even men with purple hair or dyed crazy colors of red hair. Every time I get my hair cut, my lady just suggests that I color it something, brown, just anything besides white. But I'm way too ADD to sit there that long. But there was a time where that kind of, people wouldn't get jobs because of that kind of stuff. And is that in the best interest of the organization? I would argue it's not. Our personal preferences for people's appearance, and the same goes for weight issues and stuff like that. People, is that in the best interest of the organization? Does somebody really going to perform that differently in a role because the color of their hair? I would argue probably not. And so just hiring people who conform to our identities of what somebody's supposed to look like in the workplace is probably, for me anyway, it would be an unethical decision to make those kind of calls. And of course, sexual harassment, we've been through the whole Me Too problem. That's a obvious kind of unethical behavior that is also happens to be illegal. And by the way, if you're in Texas, with this session effective September 1st, the Texas legislature passed new laws regarding sexual harassment. And it's a lawyer on my podcast, Julie Ross, and the podcast I think drops next week about it, said this is probably some of the biggest labor law changes we've seen in her career as an employment law attorney. So you want to pay attention to that, just since I mentioned sexual harassment. And then you've also got violations of health or safety issues. We'll talk about Boeing in a minute, but in your own organization, there are places where maybe it'll save us a little money, or we just don't have time to do it right now. So we can make certain decisions about safety, and maybe we put people at risk. And I would argue that those are probably issues where it's an unethical behavior inside the organization when we put people at risk. Now, when we're making ethical decisions, we can make them and find ourselves in a situation where we've got two choices and neither choice is necessarily wrong. It's apples and oranges, but there's nothing wrong with an apple. There's nothing wrong with an orange. They're both good decisions. So how do we decide what decision to make? And that's where it goes back to our values and what are the values that we really manifest as the organization, or that we hope to manifest. Those aspirational values that we'd like to be seen for, we'd like to be recognized for, we'd like our organization to live by. Whatever those values are, those can help make the decision between two things that aren't necessarily right and wrong. It's just which one's more right for our organization at this particular time. And this is a personal rule of thumb, but when I'm faced with those kind of situations, one of my big things in life is finding ways to end suffering. I'm a big believer that the most natural state of humankind is suffering. And civilization over the millennia, the whole point of civilization has been to relieve suffering, to to create less suffering on an individual basis. And when civilization is at its best, we reduce suffering. And it's a long, slow path. But so that's a personal thing for me is that personally, I want to contribute to ending suffering as much as I can. And so when I'm looking at decisions and trying to make a decision, one of the factors that's important to me, and it may be totally different for you, but is which one of these two solutions, which seem equally right or no less wrong than the other, which one of these will end the most suffering? Because that's one of my personal values. And so in your organization, you've got to look, what are our values? What do we say? If one of your values is fun, and you really mean it when you say, I see a lot of organizations that are boring as hell and just real, blah. But when you look on their values poster or their wall, one of their values is fun. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe fun for a bunch of accountants, but it's not my idea of fun. But if your let's say your value is fun, and you've got two options, and one of them happens to be a lot more fun than the other one, and they're otherwise equally balanced, and then do the fun one, right? It's pretty straightforward, and those are the kind of things that I think, as when we're making these choices between right and right, as we can go back to our values and try to figure it out from there. Now, in the corporate boardroom, those of you with larger organizations, but or with boards, some sort of boards of directors, nonprofit environments certainly have those in small organizations, or maybe you have private ownership, but your owners come together to make decisions. It's not uncommon for there to be a corporate code of ethics, right? It's this corporate governance idea that we have these policies and practices in place, we have accountabilities in place, we have controls in our businesses in place to prevent certain kinds of fraud or bad behavior. And that's what our codes of ethics are really a part of, is this structure to make sure that the organization is doing the right thing according to the guidance provided by their board of directors or their ownerships, shareholders, or whatever the decision-making structure is in that organization. And so if you're in a very large organization, or certainly a publicly traded organization, you probably got a code of ethics that you're paying attention to. It's, and they should really help you as an organization make decisions between both the right and the right, or we just don't tolerate this kind of behavior in the organization. Now, unfortunately, often, you may have leaders in your organization who don't really abide by that. And that's where we really have to decide if those, if that code of ethics and all these fancy prosaic statements that our board of directors may say, if they won't hold our leadership accountable when they don't live up to that code of ethics, that's a sign to everybody that they're not serious about it. And you're inviting, as you'll see in a little while, you're inviting even more bad behavior. And then there's the idea beyond governance of corporate social responsibility. And the idea that as a business, we have responsibility outside of just following the rules and just making good business decisions and just treating our employees and customers and suppliers fairly. We have a larger commitment, a larger responsibility, I guess, to our community, and maybe to our nation, and maybe to the world, depending on the size of your organization and the scope of maybe your leader's imagination. But we have this idea that we should be sustainable, that we should engage in kinds of philanthropy that benefit our community. And often, and I think when it's at its best, that philanthropy looks at what does our organization do as a business? What do we, and who do we benefit? Who benefits? But maybe who's taken not advantage of, but who's not benefiting from what our organization does, and how do we benefit them? And making philanthropy decisions around those kinds of issues, not just, okay, we're going to support the Susan G. Komen Race for the Cure, which is a great thing to support. So we get our name, because we want our logo on the back of the race shirt. Nothing wrong with that. I think that's a really positive thing. But I think there's opportunities to have a bigger impact beyond just those kinds of things with your volunteer efforts with employees. We're just raising employees' awareness of certain social issues. That's what they're looking for. We saw in the survey, right? They want us to, as business leaders, to take the initiative and work to solve social problems. And now CSR, corporate social responsibility, has begun to evolve into this idea of environmental, social, and governance, ESG, which is kind of takes that whole code of ethics thing, but also our responsibilities to the community, maybe to the planet, to the larger, social structure that we exist in as a company. And so maybe we're an organization that's already really committed to diversity and inclusion and equity. But we see that in our community, that's not universal, and I would argue it's probably not. And so, but maybe that's important enough to us that a big part of our philanthropy, or a big part of our community action and involvement, maybe it's just lending our voice to an issue as corporate leaders, is around that DEI issue, or protecting some group that's being abused or mistreated somehow. That is how we as leaders can do the morally right thing, meet our employees' expectations and maybe the larger community's expectations of what we should be doing as leaders beyond just making money for our shareholders. And so the book Conscious Capitalism came out probably, I need to look this up, probably 15 years ago or so. John Mackey, who was the co-founder of Whole Foods, and Raj Sisodia, who I think is at Harvard, put the book together. And it's the idea that we have stakeholders as business leaders. Our stakeholders aren't just our shareholders. There's the Milton Friedman is often misquoted as saying that a business's sole responsibility is to its shareholders. What he actually said was that the business exists, for-profit business exists to create value for shareholders, but at the same time, that value for the shareholders is affected by the impact of the company on the broader community, how it treats its employees, how it treats customers, how it treats suppliers, and how it behaves inside the community. And we've seen studies after study, including some of the work of that you see in Conscious Capitalism, that those companies that do engage in really ethical behavior towards all these stakeholders in the organization, both inside and outside, including the community, the government, regulatory officials, those who are ethical in all their interactions tend to have a higher rate of return than companies that are just focused solely on the bottom line. Now, we see a lot of companies that are thinking very short term, that are concerned with today or tomorrow's stock price, and that's as far down the road as they're looking. I think we'll find more and more that those guys are the least successful in retaining the kind of employees that they want over the long term, and maintaining key supplier relationships, or having the support when it's needed to do the right thing of government and other community leaders. So back to Andy Fastow. In an article, in an interview that he did a few years ago, he said outright, people at Enron were incentivized to do the wrong thing, and senior management set very bad examples by the decisions they were making. We had senior executives, especially myself, who were doing deals that sent a bad ethical message. Okay, I think I don't disagree with that. People at Enron were incentivized to do the wrong thing, and management people saw management doing it, and there was more pressure. When you see your leaders doing what you think is not the right thing, you feel pressure. And we'll see a study that supports this in a bit. When your employees see misbehavior, bad behavior, unethical behavior, they expect, they feel pressure to engage in that same conduct, right? It's when we were kids and we told our parents, well, all my friends are doing it. And our parents said, well, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it? Well, it's the same thing here, right? We feel that pressure, even as grown-ass adults, we feel this pressure to do what our peers are doing. We want to be part of the in group. We want to, and we've got these jobs, right? We go to work to get paid, and we want to advance and grow in our positions. And when we see our leaders misbehaving, and we see the people who advance in the organization and are successful and are rewarded in the organization misbehaving, that puts pressure on me as an employee to do that. Either I've got to do that or I got to get out, right? And right now we're seeing the Great Resignation, and I've got my own opinions about the Great Resignation. I just think it's pent-up demand, pent-up desire to change employers, and people didn't change during COVID. And now that things are thawing out and employers are hiring, I think we're just seeing 18 months of that all pushed into maybe 1 or 2 quarters. And I think we'll probably get back to something closer to equilibrium, hopefully at the beginning of next year. But that's aside. That's free bonus of Coffey, the Gospel of Creating a Coffee. I love this. John Amici was a NBA basketball player, and now he lives in the UK and is a psychologist, and he works he focuses all his efforts on the workplace, on building successful workplaces. He's a really interesting guy. And he was on Adam Grant's podcast not long ago. And I was listening to Adam Grant's podcast, which is called, oh, somebody drop a note in the comments. I can't think of it'll come to me what Adam Grant's podcast is. But anyway, I was listening to his interview with John Amici, and I was like, oh, wow, that's he said this: a culture is defined by the worst behavior tolerated. And I thought, this is so good. And I knew I wouldn't remember when I got where I was going to stop and write that down. So I pulled over to the side of the road and I grabbed my phone, and I typed it out in a message, an email to myself. A culture is defined by the worst behavior tolerated. It makes so much sense, right? We can say we've got all these aspirational values, and this is how we do, we're an ethical organization. But when you look at what behavior we actually tolerate in the organization, that tells you where we really are, right? The worst behavior tolerated is really where we are as an organization. And I think that should be the wake-up call for all business leaders, to look around your organization. Again, it goes back to, what are you putting up with? Because, and usually when you're putting up with bad behavior, you're not putting it up with bad behavior for the sake of the bad behavior. You're putting up with bad behavior because the person doing the bad behavior delivers results. And so we see salespeople, we see product engineers and designers who are superstars and who really get the job done and give us amazing products, but they're total jerks to everybody else in the organization. And I've got a friend who's a psychologist who works with high performers who should be on the management track to really help be leaders in their organization, but they don't have the skills to manage people, to work with people. And he helps them develop those skills. And often that's changing how they behave, changing their own personal behaviors, so that they can actually be influential as leaders. But I think we're willing to look the other way sometimes when we've got a high performer who's doing bad behavior, and we will tolerate the behavior because we want those results. And that tells you kind of where you really are as an organization ethically. And so Boeing, we've all heard about the 737 MAX. According to news reports and the lawsuits that are out there now, in designing and building the 737 MAX, Boeing allegedly cut safety corners in order to keep the price right and to deliver the aircraft on time. And of course, we saw a couple, 2 or 3 instances, I guess, where there were problems with 737s in the air, and some of them led to crashes and people died. And then they pulled, you got to think what that meant. Again, that's mispricing the risk, because they had to pull the entire fleet of 737 MAXs from all the airlines all over the world and park them for a year and a half. Think about what that costs Boeing. And I would never say do the right thing because it's expensive not to, but it is expensive not to. And then Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos, her trial is going on, her criminal trial is going on right now. And so far, I think it's going to be just an interesting trial to see what kind of defense they put on. But Theranos was a blood testing company. And she had this idea, Elizabeth Holmes was sold on this idea that you could build a medical testing device that just from one draw of blood would do dozens of kinds of tests. And if that was true, it would have been revolutionary. It would have had such a giant impact on world health if you didn't have to send all these blood samples and draw all these multiple draws and send them to labs. If this one testing device could do all of that, often in the field, maybe. Think of what it would mean for underserved communities, for whole countries that were struggling with health issues. The problem is they had this idea and they were really bought into the idea, but their technology apparently didn't work. And they were really committed to the idea that it would work. just give us a little more time, we'll get there, that kind of idea. But in the meantime, they had investors and they needed to show results. And so allegedly, um, Elizabeth Holmes and the other leaders in the organization falsified test results. They used other companies' testing equipment to come up with the actual results, and then claimed that their own equipment did those results. They just were, basically lying about the efficacy of their products. So that's probably, there's a great podcast called The Dropout podcast series just about what happened at Theranos, called, again, The Dropout. I really recommend it. But I think Elizabeth Holmes probably really was committed to doing the right thing. But she was so focused on the right thing in the long-term outcome that in the short term, she was willing to just compromise everything and all, any kind of ethical or moral belief. And it got to the point where if employees raised their hands and said, hey, I got a concern about this, they could be fired, threatened with lawsuits. They allegedly, Theranos put private investigators out to follow their own employees around. I mean, it got to be a pretty coercive and threatening type of environment, because when you know you're not doing the right thing, you don't send out private investigators to follow your employees around routinely if you think everything's going right in your company and you're making the right decisions. You only do that when you think you've got something to lose because you're trying to keep secrets. And then, of course, we've got the Me Too movement, and that's had far-reaching impacts in some parts of society, and probably a long way to go. But we've seen that there were leaders, and especially in the entertainment industry, who were taking advantage of their positions and abusing women as part of that process, and in some cases men. And we had those kind of issues, and we tolerate them. And that, again, it goes back to Harvey Weinstein's issues were not a surprise to anybody in Hollywood, right? It was, everybody knew, or they at least heard the rumors, but he was really powerful and he could really improve your career. And people put up with a lot in order to be near him, and to certainly not to, so they don't get on his enemies list or whatever, but they put up with a lot. And that, we see bad behavior, and there are reasons we put up with it. And we got to figure out what those reasons are and eliminate those from our thinking, because doing the right thing is not always going to be the most optimal decision when it comes to short-term profits and gain, and short-term gains. But in the long term, it is always going to be the better choice for relationships and for people. And so we've talked a lot about other companies. Let's talk about your company. Okay, how in your organization do you act and monitor and police ethics? Well, I would argue that I spend most of my time working with employers, and especially around their employee selection process. And it amazes me how many employers view resumes as, it's a polite lie. We'll accept it. Okay, you can lie on your resume, and a lot of companies will forgive it. And I, quite honestly, the first commandment in the gospel according to Coffey is, if they lie to you coming in the door, it's unreasonable to expect their behavior to change after you've hired them. But we put up with this. We see people, lying on their resume, or stretching the truth, or craftily omitting information from the resume. And in fact, there's a whole industry of resume coaches out there, and some of them do a good job of just helping you format and present your best story to an employer. And some of them just flat help you lie, help you omit things, or help you find ways to say things that omit the important stuff that an employer really should know, just to get you in the door. If it was up to me, we would get rid of resumes completely, and every applicant for a job would go through the exact same application process and answer the same questions directly. Because there's nothing you learn from a resume that you can't learn from an application process. And the application process is fair and it removes bias, because all a pretty resume or a really well-structured resume says is this person could afford to go hire an expert to craft the resume. That doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the employee once they're in your organization. And I think we have this bias against really attractive resumes. They seem professional. And I think Angela Shaw was on my podcast recently, and she said professionalism is in some ways the new ism, because what we think is professional is often, well, what we really mean is things that are acceptable to me, things that, people who act and behave like me, maybe who look like me, have a common background with me. That's what we're going to consider professional. And so it's a new way of sorting people. And maybe it's not the way, looking at competencies and the ability to deliver on behalf of the company maybe should be a bigger focus. But so we need to look at how we select employees, and not just the employee selection, but what are their core behaviors. And ideally, as we go through that, we take a good look in the mirror and look at our organization and say, who in our organization really reflects our values, who's living a really ethical business life inside the organization, and who's not. How are our company's values and ethics reflected in the people we've brought together to bring value to customers and shareholders in the community? How are people paid here? Is this a meritocracy, or do just for some reason certain people, let's just say it, middle-aged white men over 6 foot tall suddenly seem to be the highest paid, our top performers? Well, when you've got this really, really consistent demographic that seem to be your high achievers, maybe we need to go back and figure out why that is. And maybe those demographics have nothing to do with why they're being paid that way. But that should be a red flag at a minimum for us to understand why is that? Do we have some biases in the organization? Are we treating some people unfairly or showing preference for other people when it's not really related to individual performance? Who gets promoted in the organizations? And then another good question is, who in our organization feels good about working for the company? Where in the organization are we as far as the people who stay? Why do people stay here? And I'm a big believer in stay interviews, talking to your actual employees who are still here about, why do you get up in the morning and come to work? And some good questions in that process would be, when was the last time you were disappointed in the company? When was the last time you were proud to be a part of this company? And then you do your behavioral interviewing and dig into those questions to understand what was really going on there. And that'll give you some insight into the organization and how employees see the organization, what its values are, and how ethically they behave. So I mentioned earlier that when we see employees misbehaving, we feel pressure to bend the rules. And overall, you can see there, 1 in 5, about 20% of employees feel pressure to violate the company's ethics standards or policies or the law in their work. And that's 1 in 20 nation or worldwide. But look at North America, 31% of employees, almost a third, feel pressure to do that. And why do they feel pressure? Because, well, let me go to the next one. Because they see it in the organization. Those employees who feel pressure are twice as likely to have observed misconduct in the workplace. So when you see other people doing it and being rewarded for it, you're going to feel more pressure. The other interesting item was that employees who see management doing the right thing are 3 times less likely to feel that pressure. So again, do people want to feel pressure when they come to work every day? No, they don't. They want to feel pressure to, if there's any pressure, they want to feel pressure to do their best, to contribute, to make a difference. That's why people get up in the morning. They don't get up in the morning to go to a grind where they're having to walk an ethical tightrope all day long just to survive. So in order to improve that situation, we need to give employees a chance to speak out when they're uncomfortable. And they need to feel like it's a safe place that you can speak out when you've got concerns. The leading cause of silence is fear of repercussions, and it makes sense. If I am concerned that I won't be treated, I'll be really mistreated, maybe even lose my job if I speak out about this, yeah, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. So we need systems in place where people can raise the red flag, blow a whistle, say something, even if they're ultimately wrong. They know they can express a concern without fear of repercussions. And they need to know that if they speak out, they will be heard. Maybe there won't be any action. Maybe the organization will investigate, look into it, and say, no, there's nothing here. But at least they need to know that the organization is going to hear them and take them seriously. If you've got a hotline system and employees can call it, that's great if you do something with the information. But if somebody sees something that's clearly unethical going on and they call the hotline or they follow whatever process you have, and hopefully you've got more than just, oh, we've got an open door, because anybody can walk in and complain at any time. There needs to be a structure and processes and procedures behind that put the impetus on whoever's receiving that information to do something about it. If employees see you do something about it, then that's great. But when they see they've got valid issues here, and we look the other way because this is a high performer, or we're going to protect this person, or that's just how we do things here, then you're gonna lose credibility with those employees. And really, the ones who are most concerned about doing the right thing are the ones you want to try to figure out how to keep them around. When we're talking to employee, we've got to realize that individuals' ethics beliefs, my ethical beliefs, my ethical worldview is going to be different than somebody else's. We've got different backgrounds, different experiences, and the same set of facts, even if we agree on the facts, doesn't mean that we're in ethical agreement about what the right thing to do is. And it used to be, we're going to keep all religion and politics and all that stuff, we're going to keep it outside the organization. Don't bring that to work. Well, in reality, that's just not real. That's not going to happen anymore. We spend half our waking hours at work, and people are going to have interactions, and they're going to disagree, especially as volatile as things are right now in our public discourse. So whether it's masking with COVID or vaccination mandates, that's a hot issue. In fact, I've got a podcast episode coming up on vaccine mandates, and it's a hot issue, and nobody is sure what the right thing to do is. Everybody thinks they know what the right thing is to do, but it's going to be different from organization to organization. We saw last year, after George Floyd's murder on May 25th, the Black Lives Matter movement, and that got really fractious in some workplaces. And often in the instances I was involved, I saw instances where neither side was wrong, just what their expectations were from how they wanted their organization to respond internally or externally were different. And we just need to realize we may not all agree internally even on what the right thing for the organization to do is. So it's really critical that the organization communicate when they make a decision, and that they create an environment where employees can give each other the benefit of the doubt and assume that the other person is credible. We may not agree with the outcome of where their thought process took them, but at least we give them the credibility to hear them out. And we need to understand, we spend a lot of time understanding the other person rather than insisting that we're right. Just focusing on scoreboarding somebody and showing them that we're going to do, that I'm right, you're wrong. That doesn't get us anywhere. We've got to find structures, and there's some good models out there for organizations to have those kind of even facilitated conversations with employees. And it doesn't have to be, you're wrong, you're right. But it can be, I want to understand where you're coming from on this issue. And I'm going to respectfully, I might disagree with you, but I'm going to respectfully hear you out. And I think that'll go a long way in our organizations. Now, unfortunately, sometimes the emperor doesn't have any clothes. And we have leaders in our organization who say one thing and do a completely different thing. That's just going to happen. And what we need to do is realize that ideally, our leaders will be transparent in how they make decisions. It'll be very clear to everybody, even if we disagree with the outcome or the decision that the leadership is making, we will understand how they came to that decision. And we can point to their stated values and the decision and say, okay, we followed our values and how we made this decision. And maybe leadership needs to say, this is the decision today. This may not be the right decision, and we're going to continue to monitor this. And in 3 months or 6 months or whatever, we may revisit it and make a different decision. A lot of companies were criticized because people thought they came back too early from the COVID lockdowns. And then while other people were criticizing them for staying out too long. And then some of them came back, and then they reevaluated when Delta appeared and people started really getting infected at a higher rate again. Some companies went back remote, and they got a lot of criticism. But you can't be worried about the criticism. What you got to be worried about is doing the right thing and communicating that clearly. And finally, Work Life with Adam Grant. Thank you, Kara. Work Life with Adam Grant is the podcast I was trying to remember earlier. Even if leadership is doing the wrong thing, even if leadership is clueless, and we've all worked for at some point in our career for leadership that's a little off the mark, we as individual leaders in our organization, whether we have a title that suggests leadership or not, we can model ethical behavior. We can challenge other people's assumptions and understand and push them to explain why they think what they think, help them re-examine their own ideas where we see that people are maybe making decisions wrong. We can make sure that people don't just feel heard. We can make sure that they're actually heard, that we actually listen to them, that they see that we're trying to understand where they come from. That'll go a long way. And ultimately, just like the story that you've all heard, I'm sure, about the little boy walking along the beach with the old man, and the old man would pick up the starfish that were on the beach and throw them out into the water as the tide was receding. And the little boy said, why are you doing that? There's thousands of them here, and you'll never be able to throw them all back. It doesn't really make a difference. And the old man, as he throws one back into the ocean, says, it matters to this one. And so in your own organization, you can be that one person that matters to an employee who's struggling. You can be that one person who raises their hands and says, I'm not comfortable with this decision. Or why are we doing business this way? Can we serve our customers better doing it a different way? Or can we have a better impact on our community doing this? You can be that one who steps forward. It doesn't mean that you won't pay a price for it, but you're going to pay a price anyway. If you're the person who cares about an issue and cares about doing the right thing, and you're in an organization that's not going to do it, you're going to suffer, right? You're going to sit there every day and be less and less engaged by being part of that organization, and less committed to your coworkers and leadership. And you're gonna take a lot of joy out of your own life, much less other people's. So you're going to suffer either way. So why not suffer doing the right thing? Take that risk of suffering doing the right thing. So that is the presentation, and I do appreciate everyone. I'm Mike Coffey. Now I will share that this presentation is approved from HRCI for business credit and for SHRM for recertification credit as well. You will get an email after the webinar that asks you to complete a quick survey. You complete that survey and just tell me how I did. Am I off base? Am I crazy? Did I tell too many extraneous stories along the way? I did run about 7 minutes too long, so you can ding me for that. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I'll pay more attention and maybe drop a slide or a story. But let me know. And at the end of the survey, that's when you'll get the recertification information. So it's kind of a push and pull thing because I want your feedback, and I got thick skin, but I really do want it. And then I'll give you the HRCI and SHRM information after you complete the survey. And as I mentioned a couple times, the Good Morning HR podcast, this is really just a vehicle for me to talk to interesting people that I might not have had a chance to talk to otherwise. And we drop a new episode every Thursday. You can go to goodmorninghr.com, but it's also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and YouTube. So find us there at Good Morning HR Podcast, even on Facebook and Instagram. So I hope this has been worth your time. At the very least, you got your HRCI ethics stuff, but let me look and see if there were any questions. Again, thank you, Kara. Work Life with Adam Grant. It's a great podcast. And if you ever need a list of just interesting podcasts, I spend way too much time in podcasts. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Katara. That's a great name. Thank you, Carrie, for being here. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everyone. And if there's anything I can do for you personally or professionally, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And as always, be well, do good, keep your chin up. And I hope to see you at our next webinar in a couple of weeks. Maybe you'll listen to HRCI, or I'll be to the Good Morning HR podcast. And like I said, the podcast is approved for recertification credit. So you can, at goodmorninghr.com, you can get the recert credit after you listen to it. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. And if I can do anything for you, don't hesitate to reach out. Hope to see you at HR Southwest in just a couple of weeks. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.